So, to start, we can talk about the cortex, and this is the outer surface of the brain. Typically, when you think of a brain, most people first imagine the cortex as the stereotypical illustration. This is made up of the cerebrum, which has a right and left half, and are also connected via the corpus callosum that we dissected here. The brain is covered by 3 layers of meninges. The outermost, called the dura mater, this has already been cut, but would look like a thick sac that would overlie and protect the brain. Beneath the dura mater is the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. These meninges hug the brain closely and can be observed as partially removed here. Looking at the outer surface of the brain, the gyrus is seen as the thicker outer parts separated by wrinkles, and those are called sulci. And then if we move to the posterior part of the brain, the cerebellum, which is responsible for balance and smooth coordinated movement, can be seen here. Next, let's talk about the brain stem. This generally houses most of the cranial nerves, nuclei, and is a pathway for connecting the cerebrum and the spinal cord to help process sensory information as well as relaying motor functions. The brain stem is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. The ventricles, which are responsible for synthesizing and transporting cerebral spinal fluid, can be seen here. Here at the lateral ventricle, which is the most anterior, flows into the third ventricle, and from the third ventricle flows into the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. You can see it here at the midline of the brain, but it's a little bit difficult to see. However, you can see the beginning of it right here. If you look closely in the lateral ventricle, we can see the choroid plexus, which are the vessels responsible for actually synthesizing the cerebral spinal fluid. The diencephalon, which is an embryologic term used to describe the thalamus and the hypothalamus, can be seen here. Both of these structures are important in our endocrine system and responsible for releasing hormones such as the thyroid hormone and cortisol. Here's the thalamus, and right beneath it is the hypothalamus. So now I'm going to switch brain sections to help visualize the pineal body a bit better. This is important for our sleep and wake cycle and for the synthesis of melatonin. So looking at the ventral side of the brain section, we can identify the 12 cranial nerves. The most prominent will be the optic nerve, i.e. cranial nerve number 2. Also difficult to see through the dissection is the optic chiasm, which is part of the cranial nerve number 2. Cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve, and that's responsible for smell. Here we would normally see it on the ventral side of the brain, moving anteriorly, although it may have been lost in the processing of this specific brain, as it's pretty difficult to see here. So if it had been here, you'd see a thicker part of the cranial nerve, is also known as the olfactory bulb. Also difficult to see, normally inferior to the optic chiasm, is the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. This is another endocrine organ that stores and synthesizes and releases hormones into the body, which is governed by the diencephalon. Although it is difficult to identify, we can move on to the hippocampus, which is located on the temporal lobe in the region seen here, and it's responsible primarily for memory. Interestingly enough, when you look at MRIs of patients who have Alzheimer's, you'll see this region of the brain deteriorate. Last but not least, we can move into one of the cross sections to identify the white matter. Here it looks like the lighter branched looking material. And this houses the neurons that send information between other parts of the brain and the rest of the body.